Welcome back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And this week's guest in a special Halloween episode is David Chang. David is a longtime Boston insider in the startup space, an angel investor, an advisor, a serial entrepreneur, and now a member of and leader in a company I can't wait for him to talk more about. David, talk to us about what you're doing now and who you are.
Jerry, thanks for having me on the show. When we met back in Boston a couple months back, it felt like it was kindred spirits, and so nice to see you again.
You as well.
Quick background on me. As you mentioned, I'm an entrepreneur and angel investor. I have a software background, but when I came up to Boston about 20 years ago, somehow ended up in the startup world. And fast forward 20 years later, I've now been with 6 Boston-based startups in multiple roles, from product marketing to CEO. And I was the first product manager at TripAdvisor. I ended up heading up PayPal Boston after an acquisition. And my most recent role, I was CEO of a company that we sold to E-Trade. On top of that, have been really lucky to angel invest in just over 100 companies. And so many of the folks that I've met throughout the years, and through those 2 experiences, felt like I've gotten some great experience on both sides of the table. So knowing what it's like as a founder and operator, as well as being an angel investor. And I spend a ton of time these days working with founders and operators and people across the whole tech ecosystem. My main focus today is I'm GM at Hunt Club. And so we are an executive recruiter with a very secret or special sauce around how we tap into a broader network. And on top of that, I joined the company through one of our own angel investments at the angel group that I founded. And so there's a little bit of a circular thing going on there, but glad to be here.
You know, I don't think it's that unusual, a circular thing, though. I've got to say, before I have a question about what you just said, I didn't realize you'd worked with PayPal here in Boston. Does that make you a member of the PayPal Mafia? Do you walk around in dark shades, or how does that play out?
We are not that closely related. And so it's funny, within the Boston tech scene, there have been a number of mafias, from the HubSpot folks to the Boston PayPal gang. And although the term mafia originated from the old school PayPal mafia, the group of people pulled together, at least in the Boston scene, I've loved the fact that the groups, whether they're from an early stage startup that was successful and then ended up sort of exploding into like a bunch of other startups, to the ones that may have been acquired by a larger company, but the notion of like this group of people being able to do more stuff together has been fantastic. And so I think that's a really big part of your own network, just making sure to stay in touch with people that you've worked with in the past.
Completely agree. And between what you just said about the mafia and not only your relationship to Hunt Club and the way that you got into it, it really brings up something interesting that I've found in working with founders. And that's that near universally, their original teams come from their professional and their personal networks. And that human to human connection, it's an often overlooked but critical part of our ecosystem, I think.
For sure. And I think the very first time you join a company, when you think about that first role, how do you find that role? It's usually, if you're coming straight from school, you applied through some very cold job board and you landed the role. And as you get more senior in your careers, so much more of how you discover opportunities comes from that network. And so it just makes so much sense to leverage that as much as you can.
And the opposite of the example you gave is also true. Absolutely true for that, intern or recent grad. But on the other end of the spectrum, it's exited founders. So the big exit I was a part of, Apicero, we have a joking, Apicero Mafia as well. We started a sort of VC fund, except we only invest in our own companies. If it does well, we throw more cash at it and give it legs. If it doesn't do well, we suck the resources back and repurpose them for something else wherever possible. So the concept is the same. We had incredible success together, so why not get the band back together whenever we can and do it again?
Yeah. And do you invite others to participate when you invest in new companies, or is it just the original gang that you work with and they're the investors?
It's a mix. So it's a
Nice.
mix.
You pull in
So
new people. Great.
yeah, so for the core products, it's mostly just us because, like, for example, I think we mentioned this before. Right now, I'm acting as an interim CEO for a company, and I'm doing that as a favor for a couple of people in the mafia. I don't like interim roles. I need to stop saying the mafia. People are going to think this is a criminal show, but for that group, but it's a favor for friends. So I'll do it, get everything stabilized, set up, and I'll move on, and that will be that. But that ability to connect at a human level just creates so much opportunity.
For sure. For sure.
And now for yourself, gosh, it seems like that would be center for wheelhouse for you. As an angel investor, I would imagine knowing some of the players involved would have, especially if they've had success in the past with you, would have some influence on whether you at least speak to them. As the general manager of Hunt Club, I had the privilege of learning a little bit more about your secret sauce in the past. That seems to be the whole crux of how that company operates.
It is, and you know this from your time in recruiting. The model really hasn't changed, and so the typical recruiter taps into a relatively closed network of people that they know, and makes sense, right? It's the folks that they are most closely associated with them, and they have this trusted network, but it's really limited by just yourself. And our whole model is broadening that out so that we have this entire community of people, of professionals, of founders, of operators who can then refer talent over to us. And we have found that the very best employees, from director level to C-level folks, generally come from some known network. And it makes a ton of sense for companies who are hiring to expand that network to include these other broader networks.
It makes an enormous amount of sense. And we can't look past the obvious fact folks don't refer folks they don't believe in
Oh yeah,
because their reputation is going along with that referral and they know that.
that's so true.
And additionally, and at least as importantly, as it relates to their personal integrity, in most instances, they understand the culture of the place they're referring to. So there's a higher probability of that there being a cultural match. And as I think we both know, given our backgrounds, cultural matches, at least if not significantly more, in my opinion, important than skill set match for a long-term hire. Nobody's going to stay in a place where they don't fit.
Yep, totally true. There is this subconscious matching that happens underneath the covers. So whenever you ask for an intro or you receive an intro, you do receive this tacit endorsement of that
Yes.
connector, right? In our world, we call them experts, but that connector is making the evaluation whether or not he or she would be a good fit in both directions, right? And so if they think the company is not a good fit, they won't make the intro. If they think the person's not a good fit, they don't want to put their names out on the line. And so that trading and leveraging of your social capital in both directions is extremely powerful, and that's what we base our entire model on.
It's interesting. In my company, Redbeard Solutions, our entry point to a new client is an audit of the people side of their business, from employer brand to recruiting practices to offer practices to how they onboard, how they do employee reviews, all the way through the exit. But one of the things that we touch on is employee referrals. And in my message to founders and owners is always the same thing. If your internal employee referral program isn't working, it's typically one of two things. Either number one, your company culture is such that that person doesn't want their name attached to your company and they don't want to do referrals because they don't want to damage relationships. Or number two, you have an anemic program and they aren't even noticing it. They don't care about it. It's not well publicized or it's not well funded. There's a reason why they don't care about it.
Oh, that's interesting. The former I hadn't really thought about, right? Like that uh, the nature of someone not actively participating is a signal around like how well they think or how good they think the company is.
One of my favorite culture questions when I'm working with a new client is this. I'll talk to people and I'll say, pretending you're one of the folks at a company, say, David, when you're talking to your family and friends about the company, what type of stories do you tell them? And you'd be surprised the insight that question can bring as to the people's opinion of the company and the culture.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's just when you asked that question, I immediately thought back to a handful of companies I've been with in the past, and the stories that pop up in my head. It's probably a topic for another show.
For sure, but without digging into it, I will say this. I would imagine if you are like most people, they were either incredibly cool stories or the type of story that you tell over a few beers with some friends.
Yeah, it's none of it's particularly nefarious, right? Like when you think about, or at least when I think about the people that I've worked with in the past, it's people you work with make the entire company. And
For
when you
sure.
think about the stories, you think about both the good and the bad ones, right? Those wins, whether it's a big customer or if it's sale of the company, and those there's losses, right? Those near death circumstances, and all of it, as you being a former Marine would know this better than I would. Like when you're in the foxhole with someone, like there's no better way to know what someone's like when you're actually in with them.
It's an interesting thing about culture, and you referencing the Marines reminds me of something that happened often there, and that's context of relationship. So there was a saying in the Marines that I trust you with my life, but not with my wallet or my wife. And what that means is I know you've got my back, but I'm not so sure about you beyond that. So, and another interesting thing on culture, and I'd like to get back to connection in a minute, but it's at least tangentially related. Cultures, every company has a culture, period, full stop. If you have a group of people, a culture will form. That is an inescapable truth, like gravity and things of that nature. The question is, do you allow a default culture to occur based on the luck of the people that you bring into the company? Because cultures are like habits in that first you make the culture, then the culture makes you. Just like at an individual level, first you make your habits and your habits make you. Or do you take the time to engineer a culture that will draw the type of people that give you a chance to be a world-class company? And I
Yeah,
think that's
I'm a
a question I'd love founders to ask themselves earlier.
yeah, for I mean the maybe engineering a culture sounds a little bit more clinical than it needs to be, but you're definitely intentional about it, right? Is at some point when it scales beyond a handful of people sitting around one single table, the two pizza teams thing, that you can't control what decisions are made without you being in the room, and you can't scale unless you trust those decisions that are going to be the right ones. And so I do think founders and operators and even large companies, like teams within these large companies, you do have to be very, very particular and intentional about the guidelines that you set, the using the word culture, the culture that you end up creating, and the people that you attract, because all is is something that you because you can't control that when you're not there. You got to trust in everyone else, and so the only way to do that is make sure you get the right people and the right people to fit together.
100% yes. And I used to call it succeeding into failure. Founders who don't do what you just described, they'll grow to a point, bring in new folks, and then the quality of their product or service will drop because those new folks don't have the passion and drive of the original team, and they succeed into failure. But what you also described is the importance. We're getting a bit afield, but the importance of the founder understanding their role as leader beyond the immediate success of the stage of their business right now is to plant the seeds so that the leaders that follow do things in the way that founders looking for them to be done.
Yep.
And again, you're in the services industry with Hunt Club. I've spent the majority of my career in the services industry. And the only true secret sauce, in my opinion, of any service business is the quality of the teams that they have. Beyond that, there's not really, there's ideas and ways and implementation and execution, all that stuff, sure. But the secret sauce, if anything, is the people. And if you're not creating a culture that draws the type of person that will thrive in that environment, you're rolling dice every day.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the piece about services, right? Like in the very beginning of any company, whether you're a software company or you're a services company, if you're a small or big one, is that the the ability for you to scale generally comes with having more, either whether it's people or technology, something that magnifies your own leverage. And
Yes.
so you can get leverage in lots of different ways. You can leverage by getting more people, you can leverage by getting more technology. Going back to your point about that context matters, the today's networks as they are laid out, they're very flat, right? And so you I've got, I don't know how many connections on LinkedIn. It's probably like 3,000 or so, but in the 3,000, they're not all the same, right? So some people I know very well, some people I know just sort of only met them at a conference, and so I don't know them particularly well. And that context is tremendously important. And the context could be a functional context where I may trust you functionally because you've done product before. And so whenever I've got a product question, or if there's a company that needs a great product person, I know to go to you. The context could be around industry. So maybe you know a ton about, let's just say, robotics, and I know nothing about it. And so whenever it comes to like leveraging these networks, I find it like extremely valuable if you can carve off the slice of your network that would be particularly good, whether it's function, industry, location, or whatever that filter criteria is, but doing so in such a way like you'll find so much more power in that network rather than it's just like this blanket network of 3,000 people.
100%, yes. That ability to parse that out, almost like how a database parses out data, is certainly key. And the other thing about networks, especially things like LinkedIn, in closeness is, gosh, I connect a lot. I have a large audience on LinkedIn. It's a big part of how my business works. So being connected to me on LinkedIn doesn't necessarily mean as much as maybe I would like it to. What really matters is the things that you do to develop that relationship. Bringing it back to the human connection piece. When I engage with somebody on LinkedIn, it can be for a number of reasons, but the goal is to get them to a place where you can communicate and we can both discern, does this person add value to what I'm trying to do? The answer being no doesn't mean we're not going to have a relationship, but it does give it context.
Yeah. Is your network, if I remember the setting, asymmetric in the sense that, you've got a number of people who follow you that you don't necessarily know as well? Or do you maintain a pretty symmetric one where you have to know the person, there has to be some sort of implicit trust, you typically don't engage with strangers until you've done something with them? Like, where are you on that spectrum?
Because I do a lot of speaking and I do this podcast, it's pretty asymmetric.
Mm-hmm.
For me, LinkedIn serves a lot of purposes, not least of which is lead generation for one of my companies. So a lot of the things I do on LinkedIn is to create engagement with people who would potentially work with me one day.
Got it. Makes a ton of sense. A very big part of what we've been focused on here is figuring out the asymmetry, like where someone has influence and where someone really has reach. And one of the things that we've been really focused on is, given any group of people, just call it a company or if it's a small company, how can you reach another company? Like, how do you tap into that other company? And so a concrete example might be something like, let's say there's a 30-person company and we're making chairs, right? Just, a random example. And we really want to find the retail stores that would be great for selling our chairs. And we have a list of, let's say, 100 retailers, which might be a really good fit. There's so much power, and this is what our software actually does. It's so much power in figuring out of the 30 people that work here and the 100 companies and 100 retailers you want to reach, like every one of our networks, because they somewhat overlap, but they extend each other, is like, what's the ability for this one small group to be able to reach other groups? And a very big part of that was built based on the work that we've done in the recruiting space, but you can see it has all these other applications, whether it's for recruiting, for biz dev, for fundraising, for, any time you want to be able to tap into the network, that it makes sense to leverage your close first degrees. And if you look at a group's first degrees, it's so much bigger than any individual person. And so it's been really exciting to see how some companies are using that.
It's interesting. Two things I'd like to unpack from what you just said. The first is this: when people think of networking, they think of the people that they know. And that is networking for sure. But that's not where the power of networking occurs. The power of networking occurs not with the people that you know, but with the people who they know.
Yes.
And that's the thing that is so often overlooked. I think you masterfully described. The second thing is, when we first met and I only knew of Hunt Club's recruiting efforts, I was all excited to talk to you about, expanding into other areas. Then before we talked again, you announced the sales side, and I was like, well, there's some thunder stolen. But it immediately made me think.
Just pulled it from your mind.
Exactly. I was all happy and you ruined it for me. curse your quick movement. The other thing that came to mind was, and you're old enough, many of the audience might not be old enough, but do you remember when we were younger, people used to talk about the Kevin Bacon game, the 7 degrees of
Sure.
separation?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
When I think of Hunt Club, that's what comes to mind is that old 7 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, there's a very, very small world of people that you can't reach within a like one or two hops of your network, and the Kevin Bacon game is one that we often think about here. And what we're doing is using both software as a way to leverage and magnify that impact and figure out who's reachable, who's not reachable, and then good humans to create the trust and the ability to find like the right folks, and the combination of those two things is what we're really excited about.
It's interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on Hunt Club. I know you want to talk about other things as well. The Hunt Club recruiting model is exceptional, 10 out of 10. But what I love about the sales model is something that I often talk to recruiters who want to learn how to sell. So in a former life, I did a lot of recruiter training, did a lot of sales training. That was a big part of how I earned money. And one of the things I tell recruiters that want to transition to sales is that I need you to understand this as a recruiter. Your coldest call into the meanest candidate represents a warm call in sales. So the ability to use Hunt Club, to use networks to get that introduction, that's got to be game changing.
I have so much appreciation for folks that do the cold call one. I think it's
SDRs.
Oh my
They're
God,
the real
right?
heroes.
It's horribly difficult. Conversion rates are terrible. You spend the entire day basically having the doors closed on you. It's not something I'd want to do.
Yeah, so I've run SDR teams, many of them, and there's one thing, and this is going to seem crazy, but hear me out. There's one thing they have in common with VCs, and that's that they can't overly focus on individual investments. They've got to focus on the value of a portfolio. Same mindset applies to an SDR. You can't look at the call, you've got to look at the block of calls. Because in a world where, going back to VCs, one X win erases a lot of failure, one really good call erases the last 100 that are garbage.
Oh yeah.
And that's the VC mindset you have to have as an SDR. And those things don't often go together.
Yeah, it is interesting how the parallels in these different industries, even different functions, like you think about recruiting has a certain methodology to it. Business development has one, sales and partnerships, fundraising, both from the perspective of a company that's looking to raise outside capital, as well as the VCPE folks, right? Because when they think about their jobs, they've got to go out and find great deals and that deal flow. Like, how do you get in front of the right people? And that ultimately also is a matching problem. And
yes.
And the really good ones, I think, know how to balance their own networks, the depth and the quality with the breadth. And that's not something that's easy to do, right? I'm sure you've met plenty of people that are fantastic at maintaining really, really deep relationships with a very small number of people. And that's great. And then there's others who are these super connectors where they know everyone, right? Like, they'll go to so-and-so, that person can introduce you to anyone. And really tough to get to know people really well, right? And so if you can, whether a recruiter or an SDR, or if you're a VC, or if you're a founder, like, all of those roles are ones where if you can balance that breadth versus depth, and whether it's using technology or using a network, like any one of those tools, if you can balance that, that's what really gives you the winning play.
For sure. I don't think, minor contradiction to what you said, I don't think it's
bring
network. It on. Yeah, fight. I don't think it's network or technology. I think it's best case network and technology. So very technology is a lever, exceptional execution is a lever, network is a lever. We're all going to have things that we're better at than others. That's what makes us individuals. But the more that we can use of those tools, the more levers we can apply, the more we can put our commuters, to work.
Yeah, Jerry, actually, that's a much better. I'm going to steal that the next time I talk to someone. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm just stealing more ideas from you. The use tech for breadth, right? Be places where you can't be, and then use the personal relationship, the network, your highly trusted folks that you, whether you've worked with or you're you're meeting for the first time. The on the people side, that's the part that's extremely difficult to scale
Yes.
and go deep in those cases. And so if you can find a good way, and whether you're a founder or you're an operator or any professional, manage your own networks for both maximize breadth and then depth, you will I think figuring out that balance is that winning play.
Yeah, and that's always the hard part. Do I need to be a mile wide and an inch deep, or a mile deep and an inch wide? And I think some of that answer depends on your role and what you're trying to accomplish. But let me ask you this: speaking of founders, we've kind of spoken around the whole startup ecosystem. If you could give any founder one piece of advice, David, what do you think that advice would be?
Yeah, I think it depends on the stage. And
Sure.
so I think the earliest founders, and for context, I've invested in a handful of companies, mainly at the earliest stages, and so I think my advice will likely be skewed towards those early stage founders. Is make sure that you are maximizing the number of touch points from a breadth standpoint in the early days. And so one of the cautions that I hear founders is that they play it very close to the vest, right? Here's my idea. I don't want to share it with anyone. But in those early days, like the idea is kind of worthless, right? It's all about execution. And I'm not going to go into the trite saying there, but the mistake that I've seen people make is like they don't share it, they don't find the right people. And the best thing that you could do as an early stage startup founder is find the other people that can help you go further. And so the go further could be a
Yes.
customer, the go further could be a co-founder, the go further could be that awesome teammate that you didn't know existed, or someone you used to work with before. Now it's time to get the band back together because he or she is exactly who you need. Those are the things that you need to do at those early stages to make you grow faster. And so the really good founders in the early stages know how to do that, and they know how to manage their time. And the multiple time founders and entrepreneurs that have sold before, they like implicitly get that, and they also have that network to tap into. And so for them it's a little bit easier, right? Because you already have a set number of people that would be really good quality. But even if you're a first time founder, like maximize those connections in the very beginning.
100% yes. We mentioned it in the call today a couple times. Building those relationships of folks that can help you with what you're trying to achieve is key. And now that you're trying to achieve that thing, that's when you call those markers in. That's when you get that help, because you're right, especially in the beginning, speed is huge. Most founders, whether they're bootstrapped or funded, have a limited amount of money to get to a revenue generating point and then to a positive revenue generating point. And the faster they can get there, the better. That's great advice. Uh, Let me switch gears a little bit. So you've got to be so incredibly well networked with the things that you do. How do you maintain your network? What types of things do you do to make sure that network doesn't wither? Because one quick note before you answer, and for those of you who haven't ever tried to build a network before, it's very much an ongoing process. You don't make a connection and walk away from it. That doesn't work.
Yeah, it's maybe twofold, right? I've noticed that in terms of just maintaining your own network, I hear this very often from actually both founders and people that work at larger companies, that if you're in any given industry, whatever your day job is, 90% of people have to go really siloed, right? And unless your role is explicitly one that is like a community or platform role, or the industry that you're in just happens to be one where you're doing a lot of network because it's part of your day job, that it's exceptionally difficult to do that. And so 90% of the time what I hear from people is that it feels like I don't know anything that's going on, right? Because they've been so deep and they've just been channeling all their energies in this one place. And it's really natural. Like you kind of have to do that to succeed. And in the brief moments that you sort of pop out of that, either because you're changing jobs or maybe you just sold the company, that is the ideal time to go wide again, talk to lots of people. And so for me, in terms of just tactically how I've managed that, I personally make sure that whatever I'm involved in, that there's at least some time slice of my time, whether it's part of the job or it's a side project, that enables me to have all those touch points. And in my example, I'm deeply involved in a handful of other organizations, whether it's trustee at a university, or as a founding member of an angel group, that give me the ability, the excuse to see a lot of people. And I find that because those networks generally overlap, that time spent there is well worth the time.
No, agree. So one of the things you said that I think is worth breaking out is community. So if you can be a part of, so David and I actually first met at Startup Boston's excellent annual event, Boston Startup Week. The only thing I don't like about it is for some reason saying those things together is very difficult.
We'll have to rebrand that some. I know you had Steph Rulick on the show recently. Gonna
Yeah,
get her
and we
to
actually
put
we
a brand
joked
up.
about that. Is she's like, well, I don't think after 8 years I'm going to change it. I said I don't think you should either, but it is hard to say. But anyway, being parts of groups like that is a great way to not only find new connections in the community that are important to you, but also catch those people again. I speak at conferences, and I used to go to conferences several a month, and I found that a lot of the same people go to the same conferences, and those can be incredibly powerful relationships.
Yeah, yeah. And one other thing I'll kind of just toss out there as a point of caution is I do often find that when people think about the word networking, you either really enjoy it or you're just like you sort of dread being in a place. And I think people frequently conflate the notion of like being an extrovert versus introvert, right? They're like, oh, networking means I have to be running around meeting a lot of people that for the first time, and I have to be sort of bell the ball, kind of running around and doing all that. It's not that. Like I think when it comes to successful networking, some of it are ones where you're in a big room of people, but like most of them are coffees here and there, getting a group of 3 or 4 people together that have different perspectives, and maybe it's like a peer group if you're a functional specialist in an area. And so those groups are ones where I think it's like so much more effective because it gives you the depth that you don't necessarily get running around at a 3,000 person event. And so I do think that when it comes to maximizing your network, that people should remember that networking is not just that one kind of running
Yes.
around in a big room with a full room full of strangers.
Yes, that's the big box store version of networking.
Yeah,
No,
there's nothing wrong with
networking.
that, right?
Yeah, exactly correct. It's just another way to do it. But yeah, no, networking is key. But the point I was driving to in my big conference example is finding people that you can touch again and again. If I had met David at that event and he recorded our podcast and we didn't connect again for more than a year, because we spoke for 40 minutes and it's a somewhat unique event to shoot a live podcast, likely we'd have remembered each other, but that's all it would have been. If we don't talk again for 2 years after this, then there's not going to be a relationship there. Just two people that met once or twice. And that's really the point.
Totally right. You got to invest in it.
100% yes. So before we wrap up, where can folks reach you, David, if they want to learn more about your companies or about your angel investing or anything else about you?
Yeah, the easiest place is my website. So it's davidchang.me. I frequently, when I make restaurant reservations, when I just leave my name, they think I'm the chef. And so if you're looking for any sort of cooking advice and you go to davidchang.me, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But if you're a founder, if you're a professional looking for a new role, if you're looking for ways to better connect with others, all my contact details are there. I've got a little bit more information about Hunt Club on the recruiting side. We have this fantastic software that I'm super jazzed about called Atlas. You can find a link there as well.
That's awesome. Well, David, as always, I appreciate you being on the show. You're an incredible guest. Until I can coerce you into coming back on, thank you again for being on this episode.
Great to see you again.
Thanks, David.
Take care.